I didn't think the first time my father spoke to me in 8 years would be a demand. Not a, how are you? Not a shaky apology. Not even a clumsy attempt to pretend we'd never become strangers. It was a phone call that started like a verdict. I heard you're getting married, he said. No hello, no warmth. Just that flat, familiar tone I remembered from the man who used to eat dinner in silence and disappear into his study. And I can't believe you chose him. My hand tightened around my phone so hard my knuckles went pale. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at a wedding checklist on the fridge. Vendors confirmed, dress fitting scheduled, invitations already out. And suddenly none of it mattered. Not the flowers, not the seating chart, not even the man I loved waiting in the next room. Because my father, the man who missed my birthdays, who told me at 16 that he didn't see the point in being involved anymore, was angry that I'd asked my stepfather to walk me down the aisle. Like he'd been saving a claim. Like I was property he forgot to pick up, and now someone else had touched what he believed belonged to him. You're disrespecting me, he said, after everything I've done. I actually laughed. A sharp, bitter sound that didn't feel like mine. Everything? I repeated. You mean child support? The silence on the line was the same kind of silence I grew up with. Thick, punishing, meant to make me feel small. Then the calls started. Him, his sister, his brother, and finally, his new wife, someone I'd never met, texting me like she knew my life, like she had the right to tell me I'd break his heart if I didn't give him what he wanted. 2 months before my wedding, I wasn't counting down to my vows anymore. I was counting down the days until my father showed up at my door and tried to take a moment he never earned. And the worst part? A piece of me still wanted to know why he cared now, after 8 years of acting like I didn't exist. I was 14 when my parents told me they were getting divorced. But the truth is, their marriage had ended long before that night. From the outside, our family looked fine. We lived in a quiet neighborhood with trimmed lawns and matching mailboxes. My father worked in accounting, steady, respectable. My mother stayed home. Dinner was always on the table at 6. The house was clean, predictable, calm. But calm doesn't mean warm. My father wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. He didn't drink or shout or slam doors. He simply wasn't there. Not emotionally, not really. He came home, ate whatever my mother cooked, nodded once if I spoke, then disappeared into his study like the rest of us were background noise. Weekends weren't much different. He'd mow the lawn in silence, organize tools in the garage, read the paper. My mother watched television alone. They barely spoke unless it was about bills or something that needed fixing. I thought that was normal. I didn't know what engaged fathers looked like. My friends' dads worked a lot too. Nobody told me that fathers were supposed to ask how your day went, or show up to school events, or clap when you walked onto a stage. So when my mother sat alone in the auditorium during my middle school concerts, I didn't question it. When my report cards went on the fridge and my father barely glanced at them, I told myself that nod was approval. I learned early not to expect much. The divorce announcement came on a Tuesday evening in October. I came home from school and found my mother crying at the kitchen table. My father stood by the counter with his arms crossed, looking exactly the same as he always did. They said they'd grown apart. He told me it wasn't my fault. He said he'd still see me on weekends. Then he went upstairs and packed his clothes into garbage bags. He was gone by morning. At first he tried, at least technically. Weekend visits meant breakfast at a diner and hours sitting on his couch while he watched golf. We didn't talk much. By dinner, he'd drive me home. Then the visits started slipping. I have to work late. Not feeling well. Next weekend, okay? By the time I was 15, I saw him once a month, if that. My mother never spoke badly about him. She just said he was busy. But I noticed something else too. She seemed lighter. She smiled more. She started going out with friends. It was subtle, but it was there. When she told me she was seeing someone named Lennon, my stomach dropped. The timeline didn't sit right. He came to dinner the next week. He was a high school teacher. Quiet, thoughtful. He asked me about my classes. He waited for my answers. He remembered what I said. That alone felt unfamiliar. Over time, things didn't add up. Inside jokes, comfort. A birthday card I found by accident, dated years before the divorce. When I confronted my mother, she didn't lie. She cried. She told me the marriage had been lonely for a long time. That Lennon had been a friend first. That nothing physical happened until after she filed for divorce. But emotionally, she'd already been alone for years. I didn't know how to feel. I didn't tell my father what I'd learned. Instead, I watched him fade further away. I tested conversations, mentioned Lennon's name, talked about school. He never reacted, never asked follow-up questions. Then he missed my 16th birthday. No call, no card, just a text days later saying he'd make it up to me. He never did. And that was the moment, quiet, unremarkable, that I began to understand something I wouldn't fully admit for years. My father wasn't leaving because of my mother. He was leaving because he didn't want to stay. When I was 16, I stopped waiting for my father to notice me. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic decision, no confrontation that slammed a door shut. It was a slow realization, built from canceled plans and unanswered calls, from birthdays that passed like any other day. About a month after he missed my birthday, I called him myself. I remember sitting on my bed, staring at my phone for a long time before pressing his name. Part of me was still hoping there was some explanation I'd missed, some adult reason that would make everything make sense. We agreed to meet at the same diner we used to go to after the divorce. I got there early. I always did. I slid into a booth by the window and watched cars pass while my coffee went cold. He arrived 20 minutes late, didn't apologize, ordered coffee, and asked what was so urgent. So I asked, "Why didn't you call anymore? Why do you always cancel? Why didn't you even remember my birthday?" He stirred his coffee for a long time, like he was deciding how honest he wanted to be. Then he said it. "You're basically grown now," he told me, "and your mom has Lennon. You already have a father figure at home. I don't really see the point in staying involved. It's easier for everyone if I step back." I remember blinking at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence. It never came. There was no apology, no hesitation, no sign that he understood what he'd just done. He finished his coffee, put a $20 bill on the table, said he had somewhere to be, and left. I stayed in that booth for an hour after he walked out. After that day, I didn't chase him anymore, and neither did he. Months went by with no contact. My 17th birthday came and went, then my 18th. Silence. I still had his number, but it felt like a door he'd locked from the inside. Meanwhile, Lennon was there. He helped me study for exams. He asked about my friends. He drove me to college visits. When my mother and Lennon got married, he stood off to the side at first, careful not to push, careful not to overstep. But when my father didn't show up for anything, not graduations, not milestones, not decisions, Lennon filled the space without ever saying he was doing it. He just showed up. My father remarried when I was 19, I found out through my aunt. His new wife, Victoria, had 2 young children. Apparently he went to their soccer games, helped with homework, did school drop-offs. He became the father I'd needed. Just not to me. I stopped updating my aunt about my life because I knew she told him everything. When I graduated college at 22, my mother and Lennon sat in the crowd, cheering. My father didn't know I'd even gone. By then, the conflict wasn't loud. It was buried, unspoken, heavy. I'd built a life without him, carefully, intentionally. So when I met David, kind, funny, steady, and he proposed after 6 months, it felt right in a way that didn't need explaining. But the moment we started planning the wedding, the question I'd avoided for years came back with teeth. "Who's walking you down the aisle?" David asked. And without thinking, I said, "Not my father." Because fathers don't get replaced. They leave. And someone else chooses to stay. The question of who would walk me down the aisle should have been simple. It wasn't about tradition to me. It wasn't about symbolism or optics or what people expected. It was about one thing. Who had actually been there when my life needed a steady presence? David asked gently, like he already knew the answer, but wanted to make sure. "Is it because of what happened with your mom and Lennon?" he said. "Because if that's the case, I get why you'd feel conflicted." I shook my head. It has nothing to do with that. And then I told him the truth. Not the softened version I'd learned to give acquaintances, but the full one. The diner, the birthday, the sentence my father had dropped so casually, like it didn't carry the weight of an entire relationship. He told me there was no point in being involved anymore, I said. So he wasn't. David listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't defend a man he'd never met. When I asked Lennon if he would walk me down the aisle, he didn't answer right away. He got quiet. His shoulders stiffened like he was bracing for something. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I don't ever want to take a place that isn't mine." "I am sure," I said. "You didn't take anything. You showed up." He nodded once, eyes glossy, and said he'd be honored. We sent out invitations the next month. I didn't send one to my father. It wasn't a statement. It wasn't revenge. It just didn't occur to me. We hadn't spoken in 8 years. Inviting him felt like inviting a stranger because of shared DNA. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, there was no greeting. I heard you're getting married. My stomach dropped. My father didn't ask how I'd been. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't pretend we were reconnecting. He went straight to the accusation. I can't believe you chose Lennon over me, he said. After everything. Something in my chest went cold. You mean after the 8 years you didn't speak to me? I asked. He ignored that. He said Lennon was the man who destroyed our family. He said I was disrespecting him. He said I was embarrassing him. I asked him what exactly he thought he'd done for me. I paid child support, he said. I gave you a stable home for 14 years. And then you left, I said, and didn't come back. The line went tight. He told me I was ungrateful, immature, that we needed to meet in person to discuss this like adults. I said no. He kept calling. I stopped answering. That's when his family stepped in. My aunt called first, voice shaking, telling me my father was devastated, that he'd made mistakes, but he was still my father, that I was being cruel. Then my uncle called. He said family was family, that forgiveness was something adults did. Then his wife, Victoria, texted me. I'd never spoken to her before, never met her, and yet she wrote like she knew me. She said my father had been crying, that he regretted not being around more when I was younger, that it would mean everything to him if I let him be part of my wedding. I told her the truth, that my father had 8 years to show regret, that he didn't get to show up now because a wedding made his absence visible. She said I was being vindictive. She said I'd regret this. That was the moment something shifted. This wasn't about love. This was about image. My father had built a new life, a perfect one, apparently. A wife, stepchildren, soccer games, smiles. And now there was a wedding that exposed what he'd abandoned. And he wanted to fix it, not by apologizing, but by demanding his rights. I didn't explode. I didn't scream into the phone or send long, emotional messages defending myself. I didn't write social media posts or call out my father's hypocrisy publicly. I went quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when your body is processing something your heart already understands. Every time my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number, my chest tightened. I started keeping it face down on the counter while I cooked. I flinched at vibrations. I felt 14 again, small, invisible, waiting to be dismissed. At night, lying beside David, I replayed conversations I'd already lived through a dozen times in my head. Was I being cruel? Was I being petty? Was I punishing him instead of protecting myself? David never pushed me one way or the other. He just listened. You're allowed to choose peace, he said once, when I told him I felt guilty, even if someone else doesn't like what that looks like. Still, doubt crept in. Not because I wanted my father back in my life, but because so many people were insisting that blood should matter more than history. I asked myself questions I'd never let surface before. Had I missed something? Had I been too harsh at 16? Should I have fought harder? And then I remembered sitting alone in that diner booth. I remembered how calm my father had been when he told me he didn't see the point in staying involved, how easily he'd walked away. You don't forget that kind of dismissal. The first real confrontation came 2 weeks later. I was home alone when someone knocked on my apartment door. Not a polite knock, a firm one, deliberate. I looked through the peephole. It was him. My father stood there, hands in his coat pockets, looking exactly the same. Older, maybe, but unchanged. Like time had passed everywhere except where it mattered. I didn't open the door. What do you want? I asked through the wood, my voice steadier than I felt. I just want to talk, he said, face to face. There's nothing to talk about, I said. He stood there for another minute, then he left. I watched from the window as he got into his car and drove away, my legs shaking so hard I had to sit down. That night, I called my mother. She didn't sound surprised. If he shows up again, you call the police, she said calmly. You don't owe him access to you. The week before the wedding was a blur of fittings, emails, timelines. I threw myself into logistics because structure felt safer than emotion. David and I warned the venue coordinator. We gave them my father's name and description, just in case. On the wedding day, the sky was clear, the kind of blue people talk about for years after. Lennon arrived early, wearing a new suit, hands trembling slightly. He asked me one last time if I was sure. I looked at him, this man who never raised his voice, never demanded anything, never treated love like a transaction. I've never been more sure, I said. When the doors opened and the music started, my heart didn't race with fear. It steadied. Lennon offered his arm. We walked forward together. My father wasn't there. The ceremony was perfect, quiet, joyful, real. I married the man I loved without interruption or drama. I thought that would be the end. I was wrong. The day after the wedding, while packing for our honeymoon, I received a text message from my father. It was long, and it wasn't about reconciliation. It was about humiliation. I read my father's message twice. Not because it was complicated, but because part of me couldn't believe he'd actually written it. He said I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. He said I'd publicly humiliated him. He said I'd chosen another man over my real father and proved how manipulated I was by my mother and Lennon. Then came the line that finally snapped something inside me. I'm done trying to have a relationship with you. You've lost the privilege of calling me your father. I stared at the screen, my suitcase open on the bed, swimsuits folded neatly beside sandals I suddenly didn't feel excited about anymore. He was disowning me. Again. Only this time he was framing it like a punishment, like I was losing something valuable instead of being released from something that had hurt me for years. I wrote back. Not a rant, not a defense, just the truth. I told him he'd stopped being my father 8 years ago. The moment he told me there was no point in staying involved in my life. I told him he didn't get to show up now and demand a role he'd never earned. I told him Lennon had been more of a father to me in 8 years than he'd been in 16. Then I asked him to stop contacting me. He never responded, but his wife did. Victoria sent a long message about how I'd broken my father's heart. She said he'd been working on himself, that he'd wanted to make things right, that his stepchildren were confused and sad because they didn't understand why their stepdad's daughter hated him so much. She said I owed him an apology. I didn't answer. Then my aunt called. I'd accidentally unblocked her number while cleaning up my contacts. She didn't even say hello. She just started yelling. About loyalty, about disgrace, about how I was punishing my father for my mother's sins. I hung up and blocked her again. That same afternoon, I got a friend request on social media from a 12-year-old girl, my father's stepdaughter. Her profile picture showed her standing beside him at a soccer field, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling. He looked happy. Content, like the father I'd spent years waiting for. I showed the screen to David. He didn't say anything for a moment. Do you want to block them all? He asked gently. Yes, I said immediately. Every single one. We spent an hour going through my accounts, blocking my father, his wife, my aunt, my uncle, extended family, anyone connected to that life. When we were done, it felt like closing 100 tiny windows that had been letting cold air into my home. We left for our honeymoon the next day. Mexico, sun, ocean, silence. For the first time in weeks, my phone didn't vibrate. No guilt, no accusations, just waves and warm air and David's hand in mine. But even there, even floating in water so clear it felt unreal, I couldn't stop thinking about that photo. About how easily my father had become present for someone else's child. When we got back, reality crept in fast. 3 missed calls from Victoria, 2 voicemails from my aunt. I deleted them without listening. Then my mother called. She hesitated before speaking. He's been calling me too, she said. He wants me to convince you to reconcile. My chest tightened. She told me she'd finally called him back, that she'd told him to leave us alone, that he'd abandoned me and didn't get to demand a relationship now. He'd called her a liar and hung up. I asked if Lennon knew. He does, she said, and he wanted to call your father himself, but I don't think it would help. I agreed. That night, David asked if I wanted to change my phone number. I said I would think about it. Part of me was angry that I even had to consider disappearing to protect my peace. Another part of me was just tired. Bone-deep tired. A week later, I changed it. For 3 weeks, there was silence. Real silence. Not the heavy, lonely kind from my childhood, but the calm kind. The kind that lets you breathe without bracing yourself. Then my mother asked to see me in person. She said she wanted to tell me the full story. And when she did, everything finally clicked into place. My mother waited until we were sitting in her living room before she started. Lennon sat beside her, hands folded, saying nothing. David stayed close to me, but this was a story that belonged to my mother, and in a strange way, to the version of me I used to be. She told me that when she first married my father, things were fine. Not passionate, not joyful, just fine. He worked long hours, but he came home for dinner. They talked. They watched television together. There was at least the idea of partnership. Then I was born, and something in him shut down. He started staying later at work. He stopped asking her about her day. He stopped touching her. No affection, no warmth, no curiosity. She said it felt like a switch had flipped, and suddenly she was sharing a house with a stranger. She tried. Date nights, conversations, counseling. Every suggestion was brushed off. He told her she was overreacting, that he was stressed, that she needed to give him space. Years passed like that. She said she felt invisible, like she was slowly disappearing inside her own home, wondering if wanting connection made her needy or broken. When I was 11, she joined a community book club just to feel human again. That's where she met Lennon. They were friends first, coffee after meetings, texts about books, conversations that didn't die after 3 sentences. She said it scared her how easy it felt to talk to him, not because of romance, but because it reminded her of how lonely she'd been. When my grandmother, my father's mother, died, my father withdrew even more. He stopped eating dinner at home, slept in the guest room, refused to talk about his grief. That's when my mother knew the marriage was already over. She filed for divorce 6 months later. She swore, looking me straight in the eyes, that nothing physical happened with Lennon until after she filed. But emotionally, she admitted she'd already been alone for years. Then she told me something I'd never known. After the divorce, my father had told her he felt relieved. Relieved. He said the marriage had been suffocating, that he'd stayed for my sake, but now that I was older, I didn't need 2 parents anymore. I felt something crack open inside me when she said that. Not anger, grief. Because that meant my father hadn't left because of chaos or betrayal or misunderstanding. He left because he wanted to. Lennon finally spoke then. He said he never meant to replace anyone, that when my mother introduced him to me, he promised himself he'd never push, never compete, never claim a role that wasn't offered. But my father made it clear, again and again, that he didn't want to be involved. So Lennon stayed. Quietly, consistently, without expectation. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. I realized I'd been holding on to a fantasy, that one day my father would apologize, explain himself, acknowledge the damage he'd done. But my mother's story stripped that illusion bare. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong. He never had. A few weeks later, I ran into him at a grocery store. Cereal aisle, bright lights, ordinary moment. We made eye contact. He said hello. I said hello back. He asked how I was. I said fine. Then he walked away, and I felt nothing. No rage, no sadness, no ache. Just emptiness. Like seeing a stranger I used to know. That scared me more than anger ever had, because it meant something had finally died. That night, David said something simple. You don't have to forgive him, he said, but you do have to decide. He was right. Leaving the door half open had been exhausting me. Every phone ring, every grocery store visit, every quiet moment. I was waiting for something that was never coming. I was standing at the lowest emotional point of the story. Not because I was devastated, but because I finally understood the truth. There was nothing left to fix. And the hardest part? Accepting that walking away wasn't failure. It was survival. October passed slowly. Not in a dramatic way, but in a reflective one. I started asking myself questions that had nothing to do with guilt or obligation and everything to do with honesty. What did I actually want? Not what would make my father feel better. Not what would quiet his family. Not what would make me look forgiving or mature or the bigger person. Just me. And the answer came quietly. I didn't want a relationship with my father. Not because I hated him. Not because I was trying to punish him. But because there was nothing to build on. No trust. No shared language. No foundation. We were 2 people who shared DNA and a history of absence. I realized something else too. Uncertainty was costing me more than distance ever could. Every unknown number made my stomach twist. Every public place felt like a potential ambush. I was living in a low-grade state of anxiety that followed me everywhere. So I made a decision. A final one. I asked my mother for my father's email address. She'd kept it for emergencies. She didn't argue. She just nodded and gave it to me. I wrote the message in one sitting. I didn't mention the wedding. I didn't mention Lennon. I didn't defend myself. I told him I didn't want a relationship with him now or in the future. I told him to stop having his family contact me on his behalf. I wished him well and told him I was moving forward with my life. That was it. I sent it and closed my laptop. 3 days later, he replied. His email was long, defensive, sharp. He said I was making a mistake, that I was too young to understand what I was giving up, that family was forever, that someday I'd need him. Then the tone shifted. He said I'd always been difficult, that I'd never appreciated anything he'd done for me, that I was selfish and immature. He said he felt sorry for David. I didn't respond. I deleted the email and blocked the address. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I called my aunt from David's phone, so she'd answer. I told her I was done, that there was nothing to fix, that if she or anyone else contacted me again, I'd consider it harassment. She cried. She said I was breaking my father's heart. I told her my father broke mine when he told me there was no point in being my father. Then I hung up, and for the first time in years, I felt steady. Weeks passed. No calls, no texts, no messages from strangers claiming to speak on his behalf. Thanksgiving came. I spent it at my mother and Lennon's house. There were board games, laughter, Easy silence. No one mentioned my father. At one point, Lennon pulled me aside and asked if I was okay. I told him yes. I told him my father had stopped being my father a long time ago. I was just making it official. He didn't argue, he just hugged me. Later, I saw my father again by chance. Grocery store, different aisle. He was buying cornflakes. We made eye contact. He said hello. I said hello back. And that was all. No tension, no longing. Just two strangers passing each other. That's when I knew. The power had shifted, not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped needing him to lose. I'd chosen myself, and that choice changed everything. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, stories passed quietly, shifts in tone, people backing away when the truth stopped being convenient. After I cut contact completely, my father tried one last route. Not to me, to my mother. He called her repeatedly, left voicemails accusing her of poisoning me against him. He said she owed him after destroying their marriage. He said she needed to fix what she'd broken. This time, she didn't stay silent. She called him back once, just once. She told him to leave both of us alone. She told him he'd abandoned his daughter and didn't get to rewrite history because it made him uncomfortable. She told him he didn't lose me because of Lennon or the divorce. He lost me because he chose absence. He called her a liar and hung up. That was the last time he tried through her. After that, things started unraveling on his side in ways I didn't orchestrate and didn't interfere with. My aunt stopped calling. My uncle went quiet. Victoria disappeared completely. Whatever story my father had been telling about me being cruel, vindictive, manipulated, wasn't holding up as well without my reaction to fuel it. Silence has a way of exposing things. People began noticing patterns. 8 years of no contact, no photos of me, no stories about my childhood, no involvement in my milestones. Questions don't need answers to be powerful. I didn't hear most of this directly. It came in sideways comments, secondhand mentions, things my mother overheard and chose not to repeat until much later. Apparently, my father had told people he was giving me space. That narrative collapsed when people realized he hadn't shown up for anything, ever. Meanwhile, my life moved forward. David and I started talking about buying a house, somewhere quieter, somewhere that felt like a fresh start instead of a defense strategy. We made lists. We dreamed. The anxiety I'd lived with for months slowly drained out of my body. No more bracing when my phone rang. No more scanning rooms for familiar faces. No more rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I still thought about my father sometimes, but not the way I used to. I didn't wonder what I'd done wrong anymore. I didn't replay childhood moments looking for proof that I'd failed him. Instead, I noticed what wasn't there. No remorse, no accountability, no attempt to understand my pain. Just entitlement. The most telling moment came when I found out, through a mutual acquaintance, that my father had started telling people he didn't have a daughter anymore. Not with sadness, with pride, like he'd taken a stand. That's when something inside me finally settled. Because someone who can erase their child that easily was never fighting for a relationship. They were fighting for control. And control only works when the other person still cares. I didn't retaliate. I didn't correct his version of events. I didn't defend myself to anyone who wasn't already part of my life. I let the truth exist without my narration. That was his consequence. Not humiliation, not public exposure, just reality, unmanaged, uninterpreted, and finally out of my hands. And the quiet peace that followed, that was mine. I used to think closure was loud. A final conversation. An apology that arrived perfectly worded and long overdue. A moment where everything snapped into place and the past made sense. That's not how it happened. Closure came quietly. It looked like a phone that didn't ring anymore. A grocery store aisle that didn't make my heart race. A holiday dinner filled with warmth instead of tension. I didn't forgive my father in the way people like to talk about forgiveness. I didn't absolve him or rewrite the story to make it softer. I accepted it. I accepted that some people don't leave because they're hurt. They leave because they're unwilling to show up. I accepted that love without action isn't love at all. And I accepted that being someone's child doesn't obligate me to carry their unfinished emotional work. I learned that family isn't defined by who claims you when it's convenient, but by who stays when it's not. Lennon didn't need a title to be my father figure. He earned that place by listening, by showing up, by never making love conditional. My father wanted a role he'd abandoned. He wanted the public moment without the private responsibility. And when I didn't give it to him, he called it cruelty. It wasn't. It was boundaries. I'm 24 now. I'm married to a man who respects my past and doesn't ask me to minimize it. I have a mother who chose herself and, in doing so, showed me what courage looks like. I have a life that feels calm, intentional, and real. I don't hate my father. I just don't wait for him anymore. And if there's a lesson in all of this, one I hope anyone watching takes with them, it's this. You don't owe access to people who chose absence. You don't owe tradition when it costs you peace. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is let a door close without slamming it. Because walking away isn't always running. Sometimes it's finally coming home to yourself.